Thank you
Yeah.
so much for being here. I'm really looking forward to this. I literally have pen and paper ready. I know I will take some notes. But let's start with you. Yeah, perfect.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about your own community story, your relationship to community building, how you started, what it looked like throughout your careers, and which communities you've worked for.
Sure. I'm excited to dive in. So I have worked in community building in some form or fashion for the last decade or so. I like to say that my overarching career mission is I build community for people who are more than their jobs. That has looked like a combination of internal community for employees at companies or building community for folks who are part of a community that they share a professional goal, professional interest. And the common theme that I've seen there is that people are more than their jobs. And I think community can keep the humanity inside of that work. So the way that I entered community building, I was actually laid off from a startup 10 years ago. And I was desperately quickly searching for my next role because I was a very broke young 20-something. And I stumbled upon a role with a community manager title. And it awoke this purpose in me that I can use my soft skills for strategic business goals. I didn't realize that until I was a couple years into the role, but I didn't even know that this role existed. So just to walk you through my experience to kind of orient everyone about where I've worked, the first community role, I was a community manager, an online community manager for a company called Noonday Collection. I'm based in the United States, in Austin, Texas, to kind of give you an orientation there. So Noonday Collection is a US-based company that is a fashion and lifestyle brand that partners with artisans around the world and underserved communities. They make handmade goods, and their business model is that they have a community of consultants that earn a flat rate commission to be able to sell those products. If you're a US-based listener, you might be familiar with the model of network marketing or direct sales. This company is actually like challenging that and not building the network marketing pyramid scheme and just building a community of passionate women who love fair trade, jewelry, and being able to provide a marketplace. So I was the community manager for this 2,000 member community of sales reps, essentially. So it was this interesting combination of internal and external community building. They were contractor 1099 employees. So there was a goal of making sure that they had the tools they needed to do their job well. But the special sauce of retaining them was making sure that they felt connected to each other and the mission. Fast forward a few years into my career, I joined Google, where I was on the culture technology team. It was an engineering team that built all of the tools that Google employees use to do their job. But I was on a team of 7 where we ran community programming for internal community at Google. What does that look like? When you are an employee at Google, you are part of a 200,000, person employee community. Working at a company like Google or Meta or just Microsoft, you are sort of like a sample of society. That's so many people. And so we see similar behavior and patterns showing up internally. People are going to be building community, talking about things, wanting to connect, whether you build the tools to support it or not. And Google found out the hard way that they needed a team to support this. So I was on the team that not only built and enforced community guidelines, community policy, but we eventually were able to prove the business value that supporting grassroots community builders, these volunteer moderators, was the most powerful strategy that we could, tackle, because you're putting the empowerment in the hands of the most passionate community builders and letting them be the ones to build community. Now I'm at Oyster, where I am the internal communications specialist. I manage not only internal communications and internal comms, but also internal community building. It's an interesting challenge because we have been a high growth startup for the last few years. And now we are entering this sort of more stable growth pattern where now we're looking back at how we've grown so quickly and how do we implement rituals, grassroots communities, recognition. And so I'm taking all of this historical experience for building internal community for existing communities and implementing it kind of for the first time at a company that has sort of been building the plane while we're flying it. And Oyster, just really briefly, we're an HR software company, to put it simply, where you're able to find, hire, and retain talent around the world without having to create an entity. So, making sure that you're in compliance and you can do payroll, benefits, and allows you to have access to talent anywhere where they are a full-time employee. And then just really briefly, the other two communities that I have worked for that are more external, I worked for CMX, which if you are part of the traditional online community space, not quite as focused on internal community, you may be familiar with CMX. It's a brand where you can connect with other online community builders and other community professionals. I helped launch and scale their global meetup program, now called CMX Connect. And then I also worked for The Riveter, which at the time was a female-forward startup company. I led the Austin location co-working space, and then I also helped them launch an online community for America's working women. And that's my long-winded recap of my career.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much. Like to say in a nutshell, but there's a lot to put in that nutshell. So thanks for going through all of them. And so I actually, as you were going through it, I couldn't help but notice how in your roles as supporting internal communities, you've been either in the sales department, in like an engineering and technology department at Google, and then in an internal comms department at Oyster. So that's really interesting. And actually, I think it's a common experience with a lot of internal community builders. What did you, like if you were creating your own company, like where would you put the community building? How was your feel of going through different departments and the pros and cons?
I think now in this point in my career, 10 years into it, I think I would have a different answer my first couple years, then I'd have another answer 6 years into this, and then now 10 years into it. My answer now is I would sit my role as close to the decision makers as possible. Because
fair enough,
I think so many listeners are probably relate to the challenge of proving the business value of community. Yes. Maybe I haven't decided if it's more difficult to prove the business value of community when you sit externally facing versus internally facing. Usually internally facing, you also take on a bit of comms support. For example, like I help our chiefs of staffs we have multiple chiefs of staff at Oyster. I help them craft messaging. And so I'm directly supporting how we message business decisions, business updates. And so there is a clear business value to that. And so I've been able to see getting close to decision makers really helps make my job easier, and it shows the value in it. I think whenever I was earlier in my career, my preference is just put me under a manager that understands what I do. I think there was so much of my time that I spent educating my direct manager about what is community. Why does it matter? Why does it matter that I'm engaging in a Facebook group for multiple hours a day? I think that now we are in an interesting time where COVID changed things. Things moved virtually, a balance of async and synchronous. And community is now a go-to market strategy for people who do external facing, right? And so there's a lot more familiarity around community. But I think the biggest challenge was educating my superiors about what community is, why it's valuable, how it supports specific OKRs. And then now I'm seeing the payoff of that.
Yeah. So I think that's really good. I think there are two pieces in what you said that I found really useful, to go and apply is one, demonstrating the business value, because you said it in your motto, you're building community for people who are more than their job, but people. And actually that means sometimes we shy away from talking business. but actually we do need to be able to articulate it to a business value. And that's a huge skill in itself, but we need to dedicate and commit to developing this. So it's less about where you sit, but your ability to talk business. And then the second part that I loved is this element of just wanting to work for the person who understands it. So whether that's the situation or not, it's all about actually finding these people who understand it and then hold on to them, leverage them, use their network and use them as amplifiers, something.
Yes.
So I love these two ideas of not being afraid of talking business and using the people who understand.
I'm so glad that you mirrored that back to me, because I forget until I get into these conversations. I forget that I lean so heavily. I feel like I've beat myself over the head so many times around prove the business value, make sure you're showing how this supports an OKR. I've done that for so long because there was a period in the earlier part, like the first half of my career, where like I struggled to get buy-in and have understanding. And I had a manager at Google, Carter Gibson, who created this team at Google. So he's, in my opinion, one of the folks sort of starting and leading how to do this differently at big companies. Definitely find him on LinkedIn and follow his content. He was so good about this. And he's such a self-starter and self-initiator in this that he spotted the necessity for this and led our team that way. And so I was able to learn from someone who figured out how to communicate this to decision makers, director levels at Google, to show how our community programs would support specific OKRs. Now that I know, I can't unknow it. So I just want to make sure that people listening know that I started from a very people-heavy, people-forward, people-first approach.
Yes.
And that's still at my core. But whenever I talk about it now internally at my employer, wherever I'm at, I now lead with the business value so I can stay people-centric.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And you talked about doing this in whatever employer, whatever situation you're in. And we've gone through your journey with communities. And so I now wanted to try and use the variety of the experience that you had to look at what are the main challenges for internal community building. So what did you see? You had very different size companies as well. What did you see as a common thread in the kind of the brick walls that communities, community leaders were facing? And then what kind of options and solutions did you find that worked?
Great question. I think the first big obvious challenge is, how do I put this in one sentence? The balance of the company or the internal community builder being the one to provide the value, create the content, create the program, balancing that with allowing the community to be the ones creating the value, creating the content, creating the connection. It's such an interesting dance because you have to model not just the behavior, but you have to model what's possible for the community, for them to take their first step, take their first contribution, or make their first contribution. And so I think a challenge that I saw was a desire for a strategy that was very production heavy, creating content, creating programs, like just churning out a lot of things to provide a community. And a challenge was educating that we need to leave room for space, for breathing room, to allow the community to initiate those things on their own. An example would be like, if I'm not a parent, but I've been around tons of kids in my life. A lot of friends have kids. And there's the concept of you need to give kids room to play and pretend and be creative and explore rather than breathing down their neck. And I think communities, not to compare communities like their children, but I think anyone needs space and room and the opportunity to discover and create and ideate what they would like to do, what feels good for them. I cannot be everything to everyone, and no one expects me to be as an internal community builder. I'm not going to have every relatable experience, every interest that your community will have. And so baking in space and margin for the community to have opportunities to lead, to suggest ways to connect, to suggest grassroots, opportunities for community is so important. And I think that can quickly get crowded out.
Yeah. And so it's a bit of a push and pull on the content, on the creation. I think Anna Maria also calls it sometimes like ingerence versus emergence. So control versus emergence in the community, and kind of thinking, okay, where do I sit on that spectrum as a community leader? What is needed? Because it also evolves in the life of the community. You know that in the first few months, you'll be doing more to create the space, to role model. And then it's very intentional in when you step back and when you start creating opportunities. So, so if you think of throughout your experience of one community or one community builder or one company that was particularly good at finding this balance, what comes to mind?
The first one that comes to mind is Google. And, I loved my time at Google. I would not say I drank the Kool-Aid. I loved Google, but I want to preface that I don't think Google is the North Star for everything, even though they, are a big, FANG company, and they have paved the way for a lot of software we use and whatnot. One thing that they did get really right, I credit Carter and the rest of the team that I worked with as being the ones to figure this out, was putting the empowerment in the hands of these volunteer community builders. One program that I focused much of my time on when I was at Google was leading a community of around 2,000 people. And inside this community were all of our volunteer moderators. Inside of this community were all of our volunteer moderators. And each of these moderators led a Google group, a Google chat community, a speaker series, a meetup program where they might be a product manager or an executive assistant. Just they have some sort of role at Google, but what they're doing when they're community building, it's completely outside of their job. I'm a rock climber in San Francisco, or I lead the expectant new moms community, or I lead the community of people who want to pivot into product management. So it could be completely non-work related, or it could be related to their professional goals, but not their exact job at Google. And so what I did was I fostered community amongst these professional or volunteer moderators, where we create an environment where they could lean on each other of like, hey, this thread in my community is getting out of control and I don't know how to navigate it or rein it back in. Or I'm seeing that my community is falling a little stagnant, and I know I'm not required to make sure it's active, but I really want to nurture it. Like, can someone bounce ideas off with me? So they had connection with each other and they were helping each other solve problems. But then from a programmatic standpoint, I was also making sure that, the communities were following community guidelines, that if there was, something from the internal comms department or the HR business partner standpoint, if we needed to communicate a message to these communities, I was partnering with them. So there was very business value centric things. But we gave these volunteer community builders the space and empowerment to build out a vision for their own communities.
Yeah. How did this work as well in terms of, what did you observe in terms of skill building and confidence? Or what was the impact for them on a more personal development point of view?
Yes, it varied. To be totally honest, it varied. There were some communities where the person who was technically the moderator was very hands-off. And that's something that I will call out as, at the size of Google, when you have that many communities, you just have to be prepared that there's going to be a variety of avatars, right? It's almost like a bell curve, right? You're going to have the very lightly invested community builder who just owns the community space and jumps in every once in a while, but really lets the community builder. And then you go along the spectrum, you go along the curve, and then you have the most, evangelist, ambassador, like I want to like, just spread the good news of this community. And they're so invested. They find opportunities to spread awareness about that community. They're sending me ideas and asking for permission. And I'm pretty hands off, like I really let them run. And so it was a big spectrum. And from what I found, it kind of followed the predictability of like, 10% of your moderators are that passionate. 60% of them are like somewhere in between. It fluctuates based on the amount of time they have to put in at any given moment. And then, the remaining are sort of that more let the community self-run. In terms of what I heard in terms of personal fulfillment, I've heard a lot of anecdotal feedback of like, I didn't know I was good at this. I didn't know I was good at this. And that's something that I see as a theme outside of myself working at Google when I have conversations with people who are interested in pivoting into community building, or with people leaders who do a bit of internal community building in their role. Maybe some of our listeners are this. They have a different title, but they're starting to put their foot in this side of the work. People are way more natural at building community and connecting folks than they realize, because it really comes down to seeing people, understanding what they need, and allowing the room for them to contribute. And I think people who are empathetic and who understand this and hold fast to that truth and protect that space of allowing others to contribute, they'll find that they're much more of a natural community builder than they realize.
Mm. Yeah, I think I really relate to this because so I've been working as a full-time job on internal community building only for less than 2 years. And I had that moment of, oh, this is actually a natural fit, which I didn't know going into it. And then I was surprised by it. But when I look back, I realized, oh yeah, but wait a minute. I was the one organizing lunch and learns. I was the one leading the volunteer group. Maybe it shouldn't have been that much of a surprise, but I hadn't connected the dot until I started working in the field. So for anybody who is listening and is finding that that's what they end up after, this is the way they do their current work, maybe there's an opening there for a profession.
Well, and something that I imagine, just based on the examples you gave, there's a level of informality that I imagine that you bring to those things. Lunch and learns, the best ones, they're not stuffy. We all sort of acknowledge like we have Zoom fatigue and whatnot. But if you're able to like make a lunch and learn like a ritual that people look forward to because they know that there is an informality to it. Like, yes, we're going to learn something, but we're here to connect. I imagine that, when you were doing that, when it was not part of your role, there wasn't a huge formality to it because you were doing it because you wanted to.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
So when it becomes part of your role, being able to retain a little bit of that spirit of informality is a way to make it easier. I think it's natural to slip into like, okay, I'm running this program, I have this goal for it. And so like we can treat it with a lot of delicateness. But I think if we unbutton our top button about it, people relax a bit more and want to join it.
Yeah, and this is a really good advice to keep actually out of this little digression into the community leader role and all of the different approach, keeping a level of informality. So talking about community leader and each community being its own mini world and working differently from the one next to it, etc. Which community do you feel the most emotionally attached to? And can we dive into one example specifically that is really close to your heart?
Yes, I would say that the one that I'm most emotionally attached to is the first community that I led, which was Noonday Collection. I'm a woman, and when I started there, I was in my early 20s, and they really welcomed me into their community. I was pretty green in terms of I hadn't done this specific role before, but I am an internet native. I'm a child of the internet. I grew up on the internet. So it was very natural for me to, be in the Facebook group, the private Facebook group, every day. I hosted a community-centric podcast. I helped plan our annual conference and our meetups and whatnot. They were distributed around the US, but I was able to plan ways for them to connect in person. So all of that came very naturally for my soft skills. But most of the women in the community were in their, like, I would say 30 to 45 age range. And a lot of them were married. A lot of them had children. And so in terms of relatability, they were in a different stage in life than I was. And that shouldn't matter. And it really doesn't, especially if you're leaning into your role. But I noticed that as I built relationships with them, we developed this like vibe of like, they were like all my big sisters. And that came over time, and it was still appropriate. It wasn't like they were crossing a boundary with my personal life or anything. But in terms of like their engagement with me, I just felt like I had a 2,000 member community of big sisters, and they leaned on me to get them what they needed and to help them connect. And they would make memes about me, like how I was like, I think my favorite meme that they made was they put my face on Yoda from Star Wars, and they said like, so young she is, so wise she is, because they really leaned into the fact that I was younger than them, and I helped make them feel cool because they were in a different stage of life than I was. And so after I left Noonday Collection, I was there for about 4 years. That community became so close. I witnessed these women walk each other through real life stuff. So something that naturally grew grassroots style out of this community was the idea of, so it's, I'm realizing that the term has different meaning now, but the term love bomb has a different meaning if you're into like psychology and whatnot. But the idea was, sometimes you would witness a woman in the community going through a really rough time. There were some women who would get diagnosed with cancer or go through divorce or just another hard life event. Some of the women would spot it, and they would create a private Facebook event where this woman would not be a part of, and they would sort of crowdfund and rally around like, okay, we're going to love bomb her with, here's these funds. So, you can, Uber Eats all your meals to your chemo appointments, or, a woman walking through a divorce and like rebuilding her life. They would like it was almost this like community care intention. And they invited me to be a part of it every time. And there was the technicality of you have to do that separate from work and whatnot. There was no expectation, but they developed such strong relationships where they really came alongside each other and saw each other as people first, people who were more than their jobs. I'm going to get choked up talking about that, but that's like where that really comes from me. I was able to see so early in my community building career how to see members of my community as people first, people with stories, people with names, people with challenges who are navigating real life hard stuff and entering the community with all of that on their mind. And so years later, after I left Noonday Collection, there's an offshoot Facebook group called, Noonday Ambassadors Off Topic. And there's like maybe 100 people in there. So it's just maybe a subset of the community. But I'm the only former employee or current employee. I'm not like, there's no current employees in there, but I'm the only former employee that's a part of this off topic, offshoot sub community where if you look in this Facebook group, it's like the group chat that most women have of, like, I'm going on a trip and I have no idea what to wear, like help me pick an outfit, to my kid is having super bad behavioral problems at school and I don't know what to do, versus like I'm dating again for the first time at 40. What the heck? Like anything that you can imagine. And it's not at all related to Noonday. It's just women walking alongside each other in real life. And that started because they were sales reps for a company that they stumbled into. So that's the one that I'm most emotionally attached to. And it's because they welcomed me into their fold.
Yeah, I think it really brings me back to our conversation earlier of business and people, and how actually communities is a total win-win, because for these women, the community was created for them to get the business tools to achieve their sales and to just make that company work and generate revenue. But when you look at what they got out of it, it's 100% like people centric, and the relationships and the friendships even. So it's a really good example of this link again between the two.
Absolutely. And I will say that not every community needs to turn into that. That was such a special case. And before it got to that level of this off-topic community where they're like, community care, helping a woman through chemo, even before it got to that level, there was a special sauce, a special spirit of the community that really differentiated the business from its competitors, because you could join any other community as a sales consultant and make a commission and sell the products. But the selling point for this company was, we have a community of women that will actually be your literal friend.
Yeah. And it's this translates into a corporate world where, we're talking about permanent employees, because there's this really famous statistics, and I can't remember the specific, but, if you have a friend at work, you're X time more likely to stay at work. Yes. And you're not always lucky to find this friend in your direct team or even on your site, but these communities where you gather for, from day one, a shared interest, a shared problem, a shared wish of learning something, you tend to find for sure your friends into these groups. So it translates very well to the traditional corporate world as well.
Totally. And I think that launches us into another topic we were going to talk about, if I could just go right into it, what I'd like to explore at Oyster now. So to give a little bit more context around Oyster, I forgot to mention this, but we are a fully remote, fully distributed, fully asynchronous company. So we have like over 500 employees in over 50 countries. Let that sink in. 500 employees in over 50 countries. That means we have employees in every time zone. And so I'm navigating some new challenges as a longtime community builder who's been building internal community for a while. I'm navigating some unique and interesting and new challenges for myself. And I think a lesson in that is there's always something to be learned, no matter how long you've been doing this. So when you're navigating a challenge or a confusing situation, it's likely because of the community in front of you, bless them, but the community in front of you, not the community builder. So just want to give people permission there. So at Oyster, we use the phrase follow the sun. Our workplace, our community employees, follows the sun in their own local area. There's not an expectation that you are at your desk from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. It differs from team to team about what level of overlap you should have with your team members based on your role and whatnot. But as long as you're getting your work done, and as long as you're fulfilling that commitment to being available to your coworkers and your stakeholders, there's a lot of trust to allow employees to balance their work with their life, to be able to go to that doctor's appointment. Tomorrow I have a hair appointment it's today. Today I have a hair appointment at 2 p.m. and I logged on a little bit early so I could go to my hair appointment and take the rest of the day off. So I mentioned that to say, not only there's specific and unique challenges to community building, but I think that level of trust with your distributed remote employees, if that is your format at your company, that level of trust and freedom goes a long way with the sentiment of people wanting to be part of the community and not just an employee who clocks in and clocks out. Something that we do really well at Oyster is on the front end when people join the company. I'm not surprised that we do this well because we were such a high growth company for the last 2.5 years. We scaled to over 500 employees in like 2 years. That was before my time. I cannot even imagine how chaotic that felt. And so it was really important to get not only the onboarding program right, but getting them plugged into the community. And so one of my kind of to what you were saying earlier, which, sparked this for me, Sophie, the statistic around if you have one friend at work, you're, infinitely more likely to feel more engaged and retained at work. My first friend at Oyster was my onboarding buddy who had been at the company for 1.5 years, 2 years. So he's an OG in Oyster years. His name's Rob. He works in a completely different part of the company. And I don't know if we ever would have met, but Oyster engineered a format to where he and I were able to meet. And now he is like my virtual buddy. He introduced me to his virtual buddies that kind of like, they have their own grassroots, community group DM and whatnot. And they all dropped a social hang on my calendar like, hey, Rob said I should meet you. And the fact that I didn't have to lift a finger in my first few weeks just to meet people, I was like, Oyster's doing something right. I'll pause there, but I have some ideas on where we can grow next. But I know I've just been talking for so long.
No, I love this idea of the communities or gaining access to a range of community as you join a company. I'm trying to work on how we want to support a culture of community building outside of just learning communities, which I work directly on in our whole company. I literally called the project Find Your People. It's not even from me. It's from one of the members of the community I work with. But it's really the idea of how can we make it easy for people to join and find their people, because that will mean that they will understand our culture really quickly, that they will be able to feel welcome and feel safe really quickly, because we don't feel psychologically safe in a 60,000 people group. We feel safe into subgroups that are at a size our brain can manage, but that obviously impact our overall experience. So I love this idea of it's actually about enabling people to find their friends, the people they want to work with, collaborate with, bump head with, as we say as well often. So
I was going to say that I know that you didn't necessarily ask for my advice around that, but something that it sparked in me is the gift of working at a startup. Oysters is still a startup, is we sort of lean into the idea of building in public still. And I know that might vary at certain companies. Maybe you have a very corporate environment where you work. Maybe you are at a startup. But regardless, I think leaning into telling your community that that's what you want to do is a really powerful strategy. And I don't think it's pulling back the curtain too much. I think saying, hey, something that we really want to get right and do is helping our new joiners plug in quickly. Just so you know, we're going to be working on this and we welcome ideas and put some structure around it. But that's what I plan to do with some of my ideas at Oyster around creating rituals and creating recognition and whatnot. When I'm ready to let our community know that that's something I'll be focusing on, in a more formal way, letting them know that will be on purpose and intentional, not just to build in public, but also so people can participate. Because again, no one expects me to be everything to everyone. And I want them to help build what will be serving them.
So I was literally writing a little bit of, okay, how can we get moving on this morning? And I wrote working out loud, but it sounds like we need to connect to see, okay, how should we do that? Exactly.
Yes.
So we've got a little bit of time left. And I have one question that I think we've circled around maybe a little bit, because we've talked about Oyster scaling up and what that means for people being able to find their people, to find communities. And so what, in your vision, what are the next step for Oyster in terms of internal community building?
Yes. My two big next steps that I'm really excited about, I kind of mentioned it when I was talking a moment ago. I'm really going to be looking at rituals and recognition. I love alliteration. That was on accident. But rituals. So what does that mean for community? I imagine some of our listeners know and love this idea, especially if you're a learning designer. Rituals, I find in my experience, make it easy and predictable for folks to know where and when they can plug in and contribute. I think that something that can go wrong when building community, I've alluded to formality and putting a lot of structure around something. And I think that issue, that challenge, can crowd out the ability to easily contribute. People just want to be able to see a thread that is an easy, light, levity question and chime in. Or maybe there's a Friday photo ritual that everyone has. And they know oh, I walk to my favorite coffee shop every Friday morning, and like that's part of my ritual in my personal life, but like I want to share that in the community. And so rituals inherently make it easy and predictable for people to contribute. I think that whenever it's a little bit sporadic, the ability to contribute, people don't know where to look and they don't know when to expect the opportunity to participate. Something at Oyster that we've done for a long time, and our CEO, Tony, is our biggest advocate for it, is we have a channel dedicated to saying good morning. And there is something, I know, right? there's something beautiful about the ritual of, especially as a company who follows the sun, there's something beautiful about having that baked into welcoming and saying hello to everyone. Because I've seen the signal that rituals are valuable at Oyster, I'm really excited to dig in of like, where are the obvious gaps where we could have a ritual that we can implement, and rituals that can involve oysters taking that and running with it. It doesn't have to be me. And then the other thing that I'm excited to explore is recognition. I am a believer in the balance of intrinsic and extrinsic, right? We talk about it with motivation, but I also think with recognition. We have a employee like points and cash benefit called Thanks Ben. Everyone gets it every month. It's I think like $75. You can spend it towards anything, a massage, your light bill, whatever it is. And so every once in a while, we use Thanks Ben to recognize employees. But that's extrinsic. You don't have to have a hard dollar cost in recognizing employees. So I'm exploring how we're recognizing employees in our all hands, on a big scale. But I'm also going to be exploring like, how can we recognize employees with opportunities to connect and participate, or having access to certain leaders of the company, having access and co-learning opportunities. I want to really inject the spirit of community and connection in the ways that we recognize and elevate oysters for their contributions, but not just performance related to their job, but also to their contribution to the culture of Oyster, because culture powers our company specifically because we are distributed and remote. We need to be rewarding cultural contribution, not just performance.
Yeah, so rituals, recognition, and with rituals making it easy and predictable so that anybody can jump on board. So I remember the 2 R's of your alliteration.
Yeah, I feel like I need to find a third R.
Yes. Reward, but that's reward and recognition already. Great. So I think we're just about to close this. I have one final question about, we touched just at the end on the culture and enabling and empowering people to build, to participate, to join, contribute to communities. From your plans at Oyster, where did some of the inspiration come from? So if we go back to your previous experiences, which company was really good at this? And what did they have in place that made them good at empowering employees to build communities?
Yeah, I will say that something that a place that I really learned from in terms of the holistic toolkit of a community builder is CMX. One of my still longstanding mentors and friends I met at CMX. Her name's Carrie Melissa Jones. She was the COO at CMX. And you might hear that and wonder, like, interesting, an operations person having, so much knowledge around community building. But she really understood the importance of that framework of rituals and rewards and like the nuance of that. And, when I look back, we had a Facebook group that anyone could join, but it was a closed Facebook group of thousands of members. We had a learning course that had cohorts. We had meetup programs, and everything that I just described around rituals and recognition and elevating members into leadership, opportunities. CMX did that really, really well. And I also just have to plug Carrie Melissa Jones. She has continued to build opportunities for community builders like us to learn. She has her own community building cohorts now. She's just a really great follow on LinkedIn. I'm also partial. She came to Austin and stayed with me because she spoke at South by around this specific topic. I just learned so much from her. And she, in addition to Carter, my manager at Google, I think Carrie was actually the original foundation of teaching me how to communicate the value of people in terms that decision makers at businesses can understand, so you can protect the humanity and spirit of a community.
Great. I love this as almost like final words of protecting humanity and the spirit of community.
Yes.
This is probably the backbone of a lot of the work around community building. So I think in one of the other episodes this season, there's a whole discussion around, well, company is the community. And I think I recognize some of these threads as well in what you're trying to build at Oyster. So really excited to see and learn more about it. Hopefully you'll be working out loud and sharing your progress as well on LinkedIn, and we'll be able to see how this is going for Oyster. Thank you so much, Katie, to be here. It was great to learn from you and to be able to connect the dots between all of the different setups and the different types of communities you worked with. And there's definitely quite a few things that I'll keep with me as well. And the first one coming to mind is like not being afraid of talking business. So if we can all go and work on articulating the community benefits in business words and needs.
I will say it's super important to me as a North Star. I'm not perfect at it. So I'm here. Yeah, I'm here for any listener that is like, that sounds so intimidating. Slide into my DMs, add me on LinkedIn, and we'll talk about it. Sophie, this was such a great chat. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.